All right, the third episode of Thunderbolt Podcast is 2018 actual question or actual passages instead of questions from Yonsei University. So let's go over them. There are two passages, and this time we're dealing with ideas of idealism, realism, and there's also a hint of fascism, neoliberalism, capitalism, and all sorts of things. But I think it'll be good if we could go over some of these terms first so that we all know what we're talking about. So your take on, Tom, idealism is?
Well, in this political context, I would be saying idealism and realism would be talking about how we think things should be.
Okay.
You could sort of imagine it as our perfect idea, our idea of how things should be, versus realism, the way things really are, you know.
Okay. Okay. Just to add, though, I will say realism is, I think idealism is pretty self-explanatory. It's, being the idealist and following what's good. Also, we should mention that idealism is predicated or rooted based upon believing that people are good. And realism has to do with, I think, interest and power. Okay? Now, what about fascism?
Oh, well, the technical definition of fascism is when a government takes control over various means of production, but only through law, not by ownership. So an example would be the Germans telling people not the Germans, the Nazi Party, telling people what they had to do.
Right.
They're taking control over those people in the capital, but they're not actually taking ownership of it as under communism, for example.
How's that different from totalitarianism?
Well, they're actually pretty similar. They're almost the same, right? They're pretty interchangeable. Totalitarianism would be an umbrella term which would contain fascism.
Okay.
Totalitarianism could include communism. It could include fascism, any government sort of dictatorship kind of situation.
That's one thing that I always found it difficult because when I was reading Animal Farm back in school, which is decades ago, but my teacher had us differentiate between what Mussolini did, and therefore Italians we would look at them as fascists.
Yeah, fascists.
So anyway, moving on, neoliberalism or capitalism.
Well, I think these would be very different, and the technical definition of capitalism would just be free trade among consenting individuals.
Right.
However, in the modern parlance, it's more about free markets, laissez-faire economic policy from governments.
Right. Leave it alone policy.
Yeah, just don't touch it. No, non-intervention.
Right.
Neoliberals, now this is where I'm not very sure about the context of this. Liberal being that kind of usually the left, right?
Right.
Letting people do generally what they want. But here, neoliberal, I'm not really sure about that.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll find out. Passage 1. This is a fun little story, and I'm going to read it once again. Here we go. The philosopher Mencius, in Korean his Mengja, met with the king of Liang, Yangwang. The king said, "Surely you have some way to advance the national interest of my state." Mencius replied, "Why do you speak of the national interest? The only things that matter are benevolence and justice. If you, as the head of the government, say, 'How can I advance the interest of my state?' the rich and powerful people in your country will say, 'How can I advance the interest of my family?' And ordinary people in the country will say, 'How can I advance my own interests?' When people at all levels of society compete with one another in pursuit of their own interests, the state will be in danger. When people put their own interests ahead of justice, they will never be satisfied until they have seized everything. Never has a benevolent man abandoned his parents, and never has a man of justice failed to support his country. You should only be worried about how you can act with benevolence and justice." So, kind of heartwarming. Okay, so the question asks, does Mencius contradict himself by arguing that not acting out of concern for the state's interests is the best way to advance the state's interest? What are the assumptions behind Mencius' advice? Okay, so let's go over the story for a second. Yeah. So King of Liang, so being the king, obviously he wanted an advice. So he got Mencius and asked, okay, so what are the ways to make my country better, make my country stronger? How can I make my country rich? And his answer is, why do you care about that?
Yeah, that's a good answer though, right?
Right. But he's basically saying that the only thing you should pursue is justice and benevolence, so kindness and order, and then things will flourish.
Yeah.
Now, would you agree with this?
No. I am not an idealist in the sense that Mencius is an idealist. But I mean, it sounds very nice, right?
Yeah.
It's something that we'd all like to see and we'd all like to believe. It's just a case of, is that how we would go about getting those things?
Right.
Can we search through those things as an end in themselves, or do we have to follow some other order in order to get to those things?
Right. But he's saying, why would you pursue the interest of my state or your country? What's wrong with pursuing the country?
Well, that kind of brings us to the second part of the question,
right?
Already. Maybe we could come to that in a moment and talk first about, does Mencius contradict himself by saying that? To go to the second part, though, what are the assumptions behind Mencius' advice? The assumption is that benevolence and justice are somehow beneficial for the state, right?
Right.
Which we might not agree with. We may not agree with that.
Okay. And also, it says if a king, or I guess the ruler in this case, in a modern time, or president, pursue interests of a country, then rich and powerful, so the privileged classes are going to talk about, okay, so how can I advance the interests of my family? So even if the king fall, or the king changes, or gets overthrown, how can we still be rich and powerful? And the people will all, in the end, be selfish, because they will be in pursuit of, getting their own.
Yeah.
And not sharing and not helping each other.
Right.
And that kind of competition will ruin the country.
I mean, that's the idea here, right? I don't necessarily subscribe to this idea.
Right.
But I can see why you would, think that way.
Now, does he contradict himself? Well, I don't think he contradicts himself. Doesn't following or pursuing justice and benevolence is also acting out of concern?
Well, for the state's interest is the key phrase there.
Oh,
right?
okay.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Actually, I don't think it is a contradiction. If those assumptions that we're going to talk about are true,
right,
then it's not a contradiction, right? You can act out of benevolence and justice, and that should, produce the welfare of not only the people but the state. If we consider the state to be just made up of people,
right,
and in that sense, the sum total of all people will still be served, by following justice and benevolence. We don't just mention so we're not going to act out of concern for what is good for the state itself. We're going to follow justice and benevolence, and that will in itself advance the state's interests. I think is what they're trying to say.
Okay.
But if we directly try and do what is best for the state and don't pay attention to benevolence and justice, then everyone will just be greedy and awful, and it'll be hell. But if we aim at justice and benevolence, then everyone will not, what's the opposite of suffer? Do well.
Do well.
Benefit.
Prosper.
Prosper, right, okay.
All right, well, let's go back then. The passage 1 for Yonsei University usually asks students to briefly summarize. But still, there's a part to be answered with a personal opinion. So if you were to, Tom, answer this question number 1, how would you go about it?
Well, I would definitely start by summarizing what I saw as the contents of this passage.
Right.
Very briefly going over what it's actually saying, because this is quite tricky to get your head around, right?
Right.
And then I would answer it very clearly by saying, no, Mencius doesn't contradict himself.
How so?
So he's saying here, not acting out in the question, not acting out of concern for the state's interest is the best way to advance the state's interest. So the converse of that, the opposite of that would be directly acting in the state's interest. What we believe to be the state's interest will end up will just boil down to what's best for each individual person.
Right,
and this will just be, greedy people just getting whatever they can. However, Mencius is saying, instead of trying to do what's best for the state, we should actually aim at this higher goal, justice and benevolence. And if we aim for that, then everyone else will prosper. Everyone else will benefit from that, including the state. So I don't think there is any contradiction there.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And what are the assumptions behind Mencius's advice? Assumption is that if you pursue the interest of a state's interest, a country's interest, then people won't actually look at the country, but only themselves.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of assumptions actually here. There are several in the passage, and there's several implied by the passage. The first one that I found directly in the passage is the only things that matter are benevolence and justice. This is an unproven assumption, right?
Right.
He doesn't give any grounds for that.
Right.
We'd like to say, oh, that's nice, but where's the evidence for that?
Right.
Where's the reasoning? And there's another one, well, there's several, but another one that jumped out at me is near the end. Never has a man of justice failed to support his country. Don't know if that's true. Very much doubt that's true, actually, but that's another assumption that he doesn't back up in any way.
Right.
And there are also some implied assumptions too, which is that, for example, acting in a just way would actually be good for the state. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if if justice and the state are even compatible.
Right.
That's another assumption that is not spoken about in here. So there are a lot of. I would actually even, if I was to answer this question as a student, I would even categorize the assumptions as implied and explicitly stated.
Right.
There are explicitly stated assumptions, and there are also implied assumptions that we can infer from the passage.
Okay. The student shouldn't mention this while answering question number 1, because there are deeper questions for question 2 and deeper things to be answered for question 2 and also 3. But just to delve a little bit deeper in the passage itself, pursuing justice and benevolence, it's quite difficult to be done in a utilitarian way or practical way, right? Going back to our first, podcast, right? How do you go about benevolence and justice?
What is justice?
Right.
Who defines justice?
Right.
If you're the fascist dictator,
right,
justice means whatever is good for you, right? So we got to be very careful with using terms like that as if they're objective,
right?
When in fact they're not.
Another thing that I'd like to also mention for students to know is trickle-down economy, right? As a government, there needs to be X amount of budget set. Government has to print money, right? And with that money, the government has to find places to be spent. And if they, once they do that, then they're going to have to give it to either everyone or lower taxes, or even if they lower taxes, they still have to print money. And then once they do, they have to give it to somebody, and their belief that, okay, if we give this money to the 50 the highest company, the most earning companies, then they will pursue their interest and they will prosper, or they will bring our economy to thrive. But then we all know that they all in the end pursue their own interest, and not much of that trickle-down money went into the bottom people.
And that would be a very realist description of the situation, right?
Right. So, I love the way it sounds, the passage.
Me too.
And I would like to read these type of things to my children, but I don't think it will. It's a workable idea, at least for me. Let's move on to passage 2. Passage 2 reads, in theories of international relation, so globalism we're going to talk about, realism is a theory that sees competition for power as the key factor in how states do and ought to act, and regards traditional moral ideas such as justice as irrelevant. So directly, going against with the passage 1, right? Justice as irrelevant. Scholars who favor this theory argue that it is the best way to explain the world as it is, and that political agents should act in conformity with the state of affairs. While it dominated international relations during the Cold War, realism lost popularity during the 1990s, chiefly as a result of its perceived inability to predict or explain the collapse of the Soviet Union. A sense of optimism pervaded public political debate. Globalization seemed to be transforming the international order, and the final triumph of democratic capitalism was declared. In this new world order, realism was seen as morally bankrupt and intellectually flawed. Its supporter defending a world of cynical power politics that belonged to a more primitive age. Yet, the optimism soon faded. Ethnic conflict in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Europe, and the 2001 terrorist attacks in New York, and subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq all illustrated continuing influence of state power and the horrors of political violence. At the same time, the gross inequalities generated by neoliberal capitalism exposed the dark side of globalism. In this context, realism was partly revived. So, brief history of realism, right? And then the question reads, describe a recent or possible future event that might challenge the realist approach. How might a supporter of realism living in the days of the king of Liang argue against Mencius, as seen in passage 1? How would Mencius respond to such criticism? So question 2 it involves a lot of questions. It's asking us a lot. But once again, let's go back and talk about realism first. So in this case, the idea of realism popped out, and I guess around the 80s because it lost its popularity during the 90s. So realism, during the days of Cold War, right, popped out, and it believed that it's all about the interest of a nation, the power, and then it died out because through realism, it was unable. People are unable to foresee the fall of Soviet Union. I think it'll be a good chance it'll be important to talk about how Soviet Union fell. You want to go first?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm usually a little bit against the grain when it comes to these things.
Right.
But I think a lot of the common explanations of why the Soviet Union fell were, external, global, geopolitics, the pressure from the states and things like this. But and even some people go so far as to say that they're overreaching in the Middle East. Their exploits in Afghanistan, and which is hats off to them for including that as being reasons why they were overstretched and eventually fell. But personally, I usually go back to. I say usually. I think that it was more to do with internal conflicts, and there were many different internal conflicts going on at the time. But for me, I think it's just basic economics. A communist/socialist system couldn't work.
Right.
Would be my simple explanation of this, but obviously not the most popular. What do you think on that?
I think Soviet Union fell because of internal political problems. There were problems of ethnicity, and I think also the reason why this is being brought on is the benevolence and justice couldn't be met because the whole idea behind who's wrong and who's right and how it should be measured were all over the place. I mean, again, it's Soviet Union, and this union consists of many different ethnicities. It
wasn't really a union, right? It was more of a totalitarian land grab originally,
Right. So, that's why it fell. But people thought that everything was about, being the big state, big power. And mind you that 80s and 90s were also the first time that everybody thought of having, big union of power. I mean, this was the first time that Africa also introduced the idea of putting together a united, I guess, continent of Africa.
Yeah, united, yeah.
And then also Europe, European Union was forming. So, this was all about the big power, right? And the power that, these union could move around. But then
the New World Order, right?
Right, but then it fell. Yeah. So they said that, okay, maybe it's not all about power. But then again, these terrorist attacks and all these conflicts once again made, because it was the powerful, once again, who corrected all this order and small battles and things like that. I think realism had to be lifted, I guess, and revived.
Or at least the relevance of state power, became, especially with, these political attacks, the violence.
Right. I think the current state, this was the question for 2018, so which means students who are applying for 2017 would have taken it, which is last year. It's 2018, guys. And one of the things that are happening right now, for instance, I think the world in a way is going back to realism, especially with the election or with Donald Trump. It's a hot topic now in November 2018 that America had actually requested Korean banks to stop doing the banking transactions with Iraq. Or I think it's Iran, actually.
Iran, yeah.
Some of the Middle Eastern countries. And those Middle Eastern students who are in Korea cannot do any kind of banking services. And all these things. And that's basically saying, Donald Trump saying, okay, you can't use dollars anymore because we control it. We, America, control it. And if you don't do as I say, you lose all this power to trade. And once again, the world is sort of, and I think that's part of the reason why people are talking so lowly about Trump's actions, although there are some supporters of it. Right. But this realism, because America is playing it in that way, obviously there are countries who's going to follow that lead.
And there'll also be repercussions, right?
Right. Yeah. Anyway, so let's go back to the question. So recent or possible future event that might challenge realist approach. So is there any... Okay, let me actually rephrase it. And this is a key strategy idea. I think here, because the question asks, describe a recent one, so something that already happened. So if a student is a good student or avid student of the current affairs, a student can talk about what actually happened recently. Yeah. Because once again, the thing in the passage about Soviet Union requires students to know. If a student had never learned it, here's that, oh, shoot moment. What do I got to do? And if a student knows about this recent event, he could talk about it. Now, if you don't know it, I think the professors are throwing an opportunity
here.
A
lifeline, yeah.
Right. Create a possible future event. So if a student does not know of any recent event, then we could put it together. So we could go about both ways here. Describe a recent or possible future event that might challenge the realist approach. So if you were to answer this, how would you go about it? I mean, you could invent one, or you could talk about something. Right.
And also, it's worth noting that given that this was to challenge the realist approach, if you are indeed a realist, this is going to, present a challenge to you. And I think this is one of the reasons why they give these questions, to make you think from, the other side, another perspective. And that's the situation I'm in, because I believe more or less the realist approach.
Okay.
So a counterpoint to that, a counterexample to that, I mean, I guess people might say a government, this is a possible future event, but also happened quite recently, was it Thailand maybe? Governments lending international aid to countries that have had disasters happen to them.
Right.
That's not on the surface of things to do with power, right? You're just doing what you think is right. This is, following justice and benevolence, giving international aid to, say, I think it was Thailand somewhere, where there was a huge tsunami, thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people's lives affected. And there's no immediate monetary or power benefit to the countries that are giving aid, right?
Right.
So on the surface of things, that may seem like, oh, well, we're, looking for justice and benevolence. And that might be considered a counter example to that.
Okay. I think an example that I might pop in would be, many of the Korean companies are actually leaving Korea. They're building factories overseas and things like that. I think our current president, the President Moon, he, out of justice and benevolence, I think he's a big believer of that. Out of the belief of justice and benevolence, I think he's doing a lot of things for the everyday people. He's raising the minimum wage and doing all that. But that angers the privileged, the rich and powerful here. And as soon as the minimum wage rose, I think these top 50 company people are reacting to it. Like Samsung, they pulled out 3-4 factories from different cities, and they moved down to China.
Yeah.
And because of that, many of the cities are now completely bankrupt. Right? People are leaving, people lost jobs, and people who were dependent upon restaurants and houses, there were rental houses that were dependent upon these factories, they left. So I think corporations, being sort of the capitalists, they have to be realist. And if the soil of Korean I guess, business soil isn't good enough for them, they could leave.
Yeah.
And unless they have the idea of justice, and benevolence, that, Samsung is responsible for 20% of Korean people's money, or I guess, domestic or in GMP and GDP and all these things, then...
Is it 20%?
Yeah.
Wow.
So they should believe, or they should be responsible to stay and carry out some of their businesses here. But if they are all caught up in pursuing their own interests and their own power, then they might just leave, right? Because they're going to say, look, there are cities and countries that's going to offer us even better tax breaks.
Yeah.
And you're raising the minimum wage, right? And nowadays they're building things through robots anyway.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the recent events that I might say. They challenge realist approach that if it has to do with power and pursuit of their own self-interest, there's no, I guess, loyalty.
Yeah.
And people might leave.
And I think that would actually be not that exact example, but some kind of version of that example would be a great answer to the second part of how might a supporter of realism living in the days of King Liang argue against Mencius? And that would be a great example. People doing what they thought was just, what they thought was benevolent, and it actually acts against the interests of the people they were trying to help.
Right.
For example, raising the minimum wage,
right.
arguably in this sense, actually hurt the very people they were trying to help. Even though they were acting in a way that was trying to be just, their inability to understand a particular economic situation or whatever led them to actually, hurt the people they were trying to help.
Right.
So maybe some old ancient Chinese version of that would be a great example.
Right. Okay. And against Mencius, how would Mencius respond to such criticism? So let's say, if we do this, then all the merchants
right.
and the billionaires, I guess, of those Chinese society are going to leave, and generals going to leave because they're going to offer better opportunities.
Yeah.
How would Mencius would respond?
Well, I think Mencius would be saying, because we've already seen that he says that nothing matters more than benevolence and justice.
Right.
So it's either one, an acceptable consequence,
right,
or two, you didn't understand benevolence and justice. And what you did, even though you thought it was benevolent and just, it wasn't.
Right.
It would have to fall under one of those two categories.
Right. And to an extent, I think it'd be worthwhile for students to know that Mencius is all about kindness and being the ideal human being. And the opposite would be...
being completely self-centered and egoistic, I guess.
And there will be Machiavellian. Right?
Yeah. Oh, it's a great one.
So
yeah, The Prince, right? What a depressing book that is.
Right. And Machiavellian ideals would be nothing's more important than for a king to make sure that he has the power to rule.
Yeah.
And you could cut throats and do anything to remain in power so that you'll be able to rule and lead.
It's like the ultimate realist text, right?
Right. And that's going to go against Mencius because let's face it, and once you become like a general, once you become an owner of Fortune 500 companies or top 50 companies of any nations, then you own your own kingdom. And you have to think about your own interests because, you not only, by doing that, you not only pursue your own interests, you are also being responsible for the people that follows you. Yeah,
and in the sense that you acting against the interests of the people below you,
right,
acts against your own interests.
Right.
So isn't that what we consider to be the virtues of capitalism? People just freely doing what they think serves them best, serves us all as a whole better.
Right.
I think also with regards to this question, more directly, remembering that this is setting up the contrast between idealism and realism.
Right.
Right. So when we're talking about, counterexamples and examples, remembering that I think would be really useful for students.
Right.
Rather than getting caught up in the other parts. Can
we say Mencius would be extreme idealism or idealism extremist?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, and like the perfect version of an idealist. Yeah.
Okay. Good. So that's how we might tackle passage 1 and passage 2. Let's move on with the last question. a little quote from Mr. Charles Dickens. A famous author once wrote, "Charity begins at home and justice begins next door." What would be a reasonable interpretation of this statement? On that interpretation, do you agree or disagree with this statement? So, quickly, a way to answer this. Now, remember, this is all throughout the same passages. So students should remember things mentioned in passage 1 and passage 2. He or she may not have to mention the things in those passages, but still make it somewhat relatable. By the way, depending on how you are applying to Yonsei, question number 1 and 2 could be responded in Korean, but question 3 is must be responded in English for everybody. Now, charity begins at home and justice begins next door. How would you interpret this?
I was actually curious how you would interpret this because I actually have a very cynical interpretation of this and always have, and I've never really been able to see the other side.
I would interpret it as, be kind and be taking care of your country in this case, right? But remain just in your next door, in your outside. But in today's world, I will say inside within your own country, right? Pursue what's good for your own country. But then when you're outside, even when you're dealing with the people of your own, you'll still have to follow the rules that are considered just everywhere.
That's such a more wholesome interpretation of this compared to what I thought.
Right.
Shall I?
Yeah.
I've always interpreted this as, because I heard this before, and it comes in many forms. There's like a version of it in the Quran. There's a version of it, I can't remember where else, but there's several versions of this. And I always interpreted it to mean charity begins at home, justice begins next door. Charity, getting something for free that you didn't work for, that begins at home. That's what we want.
Right.
We want something for free.
Right.
And justice begins next door. Next door being that other place. So justice being something that other people should do.
Right.
People should be just to me, and
Right.
I should get charity.
Right.
That's always how I interpreted this. So basically being a very selfish person. I want charity, and I want you to have justice towards me. Rather than, I should give to everybody and I should act justly. I don't know why. Maybe I'm just a bad person. I don't know why I always...
No, but I think one thing to be made sure about this is in an international realm, it's important and I think it's worthwhile to be somewhat egotistical.
For sure, yeah. And also, I mean, it's almost impossible not to be, right?
Right. And if you look back to passage 2, realism is kind of like, okay, this is how it is. Right? Accept it. They're not going to say, okay, here's justice. Because in order to pursue and promote justice, there's got to be ideals and there's got to be morals. There's got to be ethics, right? And there's got to be code and rules. But realism doesn't really follow all that. It's kind of like, okay, I rule, I got the power, and this is how it is. Just shut up and follow me. Might
makes right? Right. That's the phrase.
Might makes right, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe mine is the more realist approach to this, and yours is the more idealist, Mine is basically people are selfish, and yours is maybe we should try not to be.
And, it'll be worthwhile to swap charity and justice into different words of students' own, right? So in this case, you could say benevolence begins at home, right? But justice begins next door. And that's also another way, I guess.
Yeah.
Right? What would be reasonable interpretation of this statement, like we just did? On the interpretation, do you agree or disagree with the statement? Do you agree?
Well, it might be easier if you take mine and I take yours, right? So, obviously I agree with my interpretation, but with yours, I would say I wouldn't agree with that interpretation because of the realist doctrine of might kind of makes right.
Right.
And it's all well and good as aiming toward justice.
Right.
I think this actually goes back to question 2 as well. How might you, what did it say? How would Mencius respond to such a criticism?
Right.
Maybe he would say that The realist approach describes how things are, like you just said.
Right.
But it does not describe how we would like to see the world to be. And if you want to make a better world, maybe that's what we should be doing.
Right.
Whereas the other side of that, my side of that, would be you're just describing how you want the world to be.
Right.
And you're not dabbling in any reality. You're not describing how the world is. So what you're saying is basically just fiction and not of any causative relevance.
Right.
So that would be how I would disagree with that statement of, justice and charity externally.
I'm always impressed with Yonsei University's questions because it's such a good mixture of various ideas a student should study. So again, if a student wants to be better prepared for Yonsei University, they should study about the aspects of idealism, realism, and read a little bit about Machiavelli, I guess.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, more generally, just maybe go through some of the major philosophical traditions,
right?
Which are, do include idealism, realism, behaviorism, all these different big traditions, and also do that in various realms of study, politics, philosophy, right. Things like that, and economics too.
Right,
you should know what like before we said we weren't sure about neoliberalism because it says neoliberal capitalism, but we could say that. Traditionally, that those are the same thing, but people use the words differently now.
Right.
Which and knowing that would be, I think, really useful. Knowing the big things, capitalism, socialism, fascism. Those are big sort of socioeconomic things that you can just look into and know pretty quickly. It's not going to take a long time for you to become, to know the first paragraph of every Wikipedia page for, the big five of each discipline: right. Politics, economics, philosophy. That would be a good preparation, I think.
Good. In one sentence, I would describe this question 1, 2, 3 into, especially question 1 and 2, would be finding or how can a student demonstrate his ability or his or her ability to find the right balance between being an idealist and being a realist. Right? Passage 1, idealism, B, realism, or 2, B, realism. And then 3 is how can you practically put that into your own senses. Now, once again, just like 2017, Yonsei questions, you cannot contradict your own answers from passage 1 and 2. So
that's such a shame.
But I mean, even I was a bit tripped off. I mean, I would look at passage 1 and say, yeah, this is unrealistic. But then after reading passage 2 and when I was asked to give an example of what might happen, right? It occurred to me that if we were all about pursuing the interest, right, not the people, not the benevolence, then we lose so much from it. Because, I mean, imagine, it's going to sound terrible, but imagine Samsung leaving Korea.
Right.
Right? So, those things. So, yeah, another beautiful sets of passages and question. And hope this video was helpful to our students. And good luck, guys.
Yeah, good luck.
All right. Thank you.